Here at Educas, we continue to provide a comprehensive package of support to aid you in the delivery of our geography qualifications, including expert advice and guidance from our subject specialists to support your teaching, and free resources to be used in the classroom or for blended learning. We're here to support you.
Hello there and welcome to JobPod. For today's session, I'm joined by Ian Freeland, Her Majesty's Inspector and National Lead for Geography. Ian, thanks for agreeing to join us on JobPod today.
Thanks, John. It's great to be able to come and share with you some of the work that we're doing in Ofsted at this point in time.
What interested me when I was looking at this was what sort of career path would take you to become such a prestigious position, a National Lead for Geography. What were the choices? How did you get there?
Sure, and my path's been a slightly peculiar one, John. I started working in the construction industry once I graduated, and worked in the world of surveying, but decided after a few years that wasn't for me. So I retrained and moved down to England, where I trained to teach, and started at and followed really a kind of moving through the ranks career. I was a classroom teacher, geography teacher in a small secondary school in West Yorkshire. I moved to a bigger secondary school in West Yorkshire with a sixth form, and then I moved to another school in Bradford where I took on a head of humanities role. Then I had a complete change and moved down to Cornwall. But at the time of specialist schools, if you remember them, and I was the assistant head in charge of the humanities specialism, which was an exciting prospect at the time. Moved around Cornwall for a little bit, ended up as a deputy head in a very large secondary school, rural Cornwall, and then got seconded out to a school that had just been graded inadequate, to go and help them on their improvement journey. I ended up staying with that school and the trust that ran it for about 7 years, and ended up as one of the executive directors of that trust. During that time, I was subject to a lot of Ofsted inspections. I think I counted about 13 or 14 during my career, and I always found it, pretty much always found it to be a really positive experience, and really admired the HMI who was working with us when we were in category. So sparked a little flame. I trained as an Ofsted inspector. You'll know that the vast majority of Ofsted inspectors are heads and deputies in schools. And I did that training and did a few years of popping out and doing some inspections every couple of months, and then decided, actually, you know what, I wouldn't mind making a career out of that and taking a new twist in my career path. And so I applied to join the HMI workforce. And started in 2016. So this is my 5th anniversary, comes up in just a couple of weeks' time. So, and I've been very happy to carry out that role for a while. The last 3 years, I've taken on the geography mantle within Ofsted, and it's a real privilege to internally and externally represent Ofsted in the world of geography.
Well, that's interesting. I as an assistant head, I led our maths and computing specialism before I moved to the GA. So it was an interesting time. We had to raise £50,000. Were you in the same position?
Yeah, no, I was very fortunate. I started in my post just after they had received the £50,000. They'd had their own 50,000 and then they'd had it matched, and so I had the money to start the work without having to do all the bidding, which was really good.
Lucky you. That was fun. I go back a long way, as you might guess, and during the first part of my teaching career, and about 15 years actually, schools were inspected by the local education authority. We had a different relationship. Ofsted just didn't exist. So it'd be interesting if you could talk us through why there was a change. What is Ofsted? What does it do?
Yeah, no, that's fine, John. And time flies, John. So you might be surprised when I tell you that Ofsted came into being in 1992, and initially it was set up to carry out school inspections. And the reasons for that, I think, were there were concerns in the sector around the variability in those local arrangements that you talked about. As you say, most inspections were carried out by local authority advisors and inspectors, and there was recognised to be some inconsistency. So the government of the day created Ofsted in a very much smaller form than it is today. Over the years, Ofsted's remit has been increased. So Ofsted picked up the responsibility to inspect local authorities, and then further education, colleges and skills providers were added into the mix as well. And then even more recently, we were given responsibility for the inspection and regulation of the early years providers. And then most recently, I guess, is that Ofsted amalgamated with the children's care inspectorates, and there were a fair few of them, to take responsibility for children's social care. And actually Ofsted was renamed in, I think, about 2007. So we moved away from being the Office for Standards in Education, as we were, to being the Office for Standards in Education and children's social care as well. So a much broader remit that comes on there. And we've also got other responsibilities. We inspect the non-association independent schools, so those that aren't part of one of the kind of organisations that oversees independent schools, like the HMC. And we inspect initial teacher education providers as well. And the kind of role, the responsibilities of Ofsted seem to just be keeping on growing. So in April this year, then university level apprenticeships will now be inspected by Ofsted as well. So that's kind of what we do. And why do we do it? Well, we're there to support and challenge providers in both the education but in the children's social care space as well, to give the very best service to young people and the adults that the service caters for. We do it through inspection, we do it through regulation in some of our sectors, not schools, but in other sectors we're the regulator as well. And of course we publish our reports publicly. And we also, jointly with that, inform government, both central and local, about our findings. Most people know us for our work in the maintained school space, and we inspect we inspect schools on a regular basis. It's done through a risk assessment process. So most schools are inspected approximately once every 4 years. Obviously, the pandemic is put regular inspections on hold for the moment, but at some point they will resume. But for schools that require improvement or those that are inadequate, then they'll receive inspection more frequently. So that's kind of what we do and why we do it.
It's interesting because it's also it's grown hugely, obviously, from what you've said. But it's also, you continuously reflect. It'd be interesting to know what the process of that is. But you've evolved, because at the GA's 2019 conference, you told delegates that the curriculum had replaced data. It tended to get the reputation of being data-driven, but actually, the curriculum is the new unit of inspection. And you there, interestingly, urged geographers to go back and look again at what they teach and how they teach it. It's a really interesting message. And that's what the best geographers ought to be doing. All of us should be looking back at, why are we doing this? What are we doing? What's the process? And how does Ofsted evolve like that?
Sure. So we work through frameworks, inspection frameworks, and we refresh them periodically. We review them. 2015, we had a review of the 2012 framework, and some tweaks were made. When the new chief inspector joined us in 2017, she set out a very clear set of principles for Ofsted. We would be responsible, intellectual, and focused in our work, and she wanted a real focus on the substance of education, or the curriculum. As how it plays out. So in that sense, the new framework that started in September 2019 spends less time with inspectors looking at test and assessment data, and much more time looking at what is taught and how it's taught. So really, this new approach that we've now had for nearly a couple of years now, but is considering how the provider's achieving those outcomes at the end of their process, whether that is at the end of a key stage in primary school, or it's GCSEs or A levels in secondary schools, or other qualifications, of course, in departments other than geography. And really, where's this come from? We've got a real drive in Ofsted to make sure that good results come from teaching the broad and rich curriculum that I don't know about you, John, but certainly when I went into teaching, that was one of the things I wanted to do. I wanted my children to have the richest experience that they could have, and to learn more about the world in which they live and the people in it. So Ofsted really wants to reflect the real learning, not potentially that there's a risk, and we've got to be honest with it, that some schools were very intensely preparing children for tests. And so there was potentially the level of security and understanding that youngsters had about the subjects that they were learning might not have been as deep and secure as we would like them to be. So consequently, we come to a kind of grading system that reflects the things that matter most, I think, certainly to parents, but also to the education community as well. The big one now, quality of education. So everything where before there were two different strands that looked at kind of academic progress. Now we've just got one, quality of education judgment, and then separately to that, children's behaviours and attitudes, their personal development, and the leadership and management of the school.
It's interesting what you said there about wanting a rich curriculum. I started teaching well before the national curriculum, and sometimes I've said that on teacher training courses, and people have said, well, "What did you teach then? How did you know what to do?" There was a lot of writing. There was a lot of writing from organisations like the Geographical Association about what a curriculum should look like. A lot of academic writing. So it wasn't difficult, I think, to find a rich curriculum to teach, but you had to search it out. And this new framework puts curriculum leaders back in the centre of the inspection process, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Curriculum leaders are certainly more central now to the process than perhaps under previous frameworks there. But they're the ones who are most likely to have that depth of insight, John, as you say, that explains what is taught and how it's structured. So that's what we might call intent. And I think probably for me, and probably it's a good place to bust a myth or two, but a lot of people talk to me about their intent statements, and I think that's they're interesting, and some of them are very poetic pieces of work, but really they do give some insight into the rationale for the school's approach to geography teaching in our case. But we know it's the substance that's going to be making the difference. So really, although many people do spend a lot of time writing these statements and adapting their websites and restructuring staffing and all the rest of it, I would suggest that intent's not anything new. Intent for me is content, and actually that's what we're interested in. So I think going back to your point on curriculum leaders, it's the curriculum leader who's best placed to ensure that the way in which it's taught, including how it's assessed and how assessments are used, are likely to give the greatest insight. So they've got a really important role in schools. I think this framework kind of stresses kind of that importance a bit more around leadership and management. Of course, there's lots of different models that can be used, but making sure that staff get the professional development that they need in order to be able to teach the subject just as well as they can.
The new quality of education judgment has three, doesn't it? It has three eyes. So there's the intent, which we've just talked about. And an intent statement doesn't necessarily convey the same thing to two or three people unless it's a collaborative statement anyway. So it's about what goes on in the classroom, right? But there are three. There's intent, implementation, and impact. I'll not ask you about deep dives just yet, but just explain through what the intentions are with intent, implementation, and impact for us. What is it you're looking for?
Sure. So intent, what do you teach? How have you structured it? It's very much the kind of the focus, looking at the intended curriculum, if you like. What do you expect children to learn as they go through your year or your key stage or their time in the school? And we look at that on a kind of continuum thread as the child goes through their geography journey. For the implementation of the second of the I's, then how that really there we're focused on how teachers translate the intended curriculum, the planned curriculum, into what actually happens in their classroom. So we might be thinking about how the breadth, or if you like, the scope of the curriculum kind of translates into classroom practice. We know that schools are required to teach at least the requirements set out in the national curriculum. Academies have some freedoms, but actually what's set out in the national curriculum is the minimum. So for us, we want to see how that's being translated into being taught in a really meaningful way. So we're likely to look at things like the teaching approaches that are being taken and how effective they are. And that probably takes us on to the third I, which is impact, because we'll know whether the teaching methods and the curriculum have been successful if the children remember what they've been taught. So that's the real impact for us, that pupils, our phrase is know more, remember more. And I add for us in the geography space with our geographical skills strand, that pupils can do more. So not to say there's not an eye to published outcomes, particularly in secondaries where we've got GCSE and A levels in normal times, what would be completed through examination and standardized and moderated by the exam boards. And they still play a part, but actually it's what children know and what they can explain or what we can see in their work that is the real impact of teachers' work.
So when you come, and I keep hearing the phrase, this is past my time really, but a deep dive. So we're going to do a deep dive into geography. What's a deep dive entail?
Sure. So the methodology for inspections these days is around the deep dive methodology. So the process begins the day before the on-site inspection with the lead inspector having a discussion with the head teacher. Sometimes the head teacher is joined by other senior team colleagues. And there's a discussion around kind of the rationale that sits behind the whole school curriculum. Out of that conversation, the lead inspector will identify usually between 3 and 6 subjects that they want to have a look at to see kind of how those the school's effectiveness plays out. So they're not subject inspections, but they are looking at the kind of more widespread school-wide strengths and weaknesses that can be seen through, if you like, thinking about the subjects as lenses. So we might look at, for example, in a primary school, we'll always look through the lens of reading. So we'll look at reading, we possibly look at, I don't know, we could pick out any of the kind of national curriculum subjects, mathematics, geography, and art, for example. And inspectors will spend probably around half a day looking at each of those, maybe slightly longer, talking to children about their learning, visiting lessons, talking to teachers about what they've taught, looking at the curriculum plans and talking to the curriculum leader about how it all hangs together, both before and after. And typically an inspector through those activities, they'll be accompanied by, often it is these days, the curriculum leader who accompanies them, but sometimes it's the head or the deputy. And we'll pull together all that we're seeing. And what we're looking at is really kind of, are there those kind of common strands that appear through different subjects? So at the end of the first day, the team, the inspection team who come and visit the school will get together with the head teacher in attendance, and they'll talk about those things that they've seen through the lenses of the subjects that they've been looking through to see what those kind of commonalities are. And the plan for the second day then comes out of testing them. We pose them as hypotheses. We think this because, and then we go out and check, and we might look across other subjects. So if geography's not been a deep dive on the first day, it may well be that geography is part of the mix on the second day, as we say, well, we saw this in subjects yesterday. Does that play true in geography, or does that play true in music, for example? So that's kind of the deep dive methodology. It's a very focused way of gathering that insight into a school's strengths and weaknesses.
I think there are some concerns at primary about what good geography looks like, because sometimes they have geography leads who haven't done any geography since they were at school themselves. And so if you can you give us a flavour of what good geography looks like in a primary school?
Yeah, I think if we look at some of the kind of principles that sit behind that, John, we've talked about scope already. So, are we covering the breadth of the national curriculum as the minimum? It's important that children get a really solid grounding starting in the early years. So thinking of the scope and how it builds over time. So really think about the structure of the curriculum. If we think back to the early years, that's the sort of place where we start to be introducing children to some of the kind of key language that we use, the vocabulary that we use, so that they can explain things that they see, and they begin to appreciate things like positionality and spatial thinking for us. And then, of course, they progress through their primary education and key stage 3. We know we've got such a wealth of knowledge in in our subject that we want youngsters to learn. So again, we've got to think about how that is progressed through. We've got to think about, and I think the national curriculum really helpfully sets us out the 4 strands or forms of knowledge that we want children to learn. We've got our locational knowledge, the place knowledge, the human and physical processes, and of course our geographical skills. But we want to make sure there's balance there as well. It's very easy for, and certainly through my own work, but that of other inspectors as well, you see imbalance coming through. So making sure that we've got that scope, but also we're holding it in balance, really, that there's the due attention, if you like, to each of those strands. Other principles I think it's useful for the colleagues to think about is how things are sequenced. Now, there are certain things we know that children need to learn before they can learn new content. So, if I give some examples there, you might want primary school pupils really, it's kind of handy if they've got a reasonable understanding of why the wind blows in the first place, or what some of the impacts might be, or the effects of underlying geology. So those kind of basics that sit around before we start moving into other physical and human processes. Got to think about how they build up their knowledge of locations over time. So important that we understand things like both absolute, but more importantly probably relative positioning. If we think that we want children to remember where things are and the impact that it has of its particular location, whether that's because it's closer to the equator or closer to a pole, and what effect latitude has on it, for example. So bringing those things together at a fairly early stage is quite important, because other than that, the order of things in geography is not too important. What is important, I would say, is the cohesion that sits behind it. How do things link together? So we know from the work that cognitive science colleagues do, we know much more about how the brain works now, and we know it's those links that are really important if children are going to remember what we're teaching them. So in some respects, the ordering, beyond getting the basics in a good place, matters less so in geography than it would do if we were, for example, mathematicians. So nonetheless, we want those connections to be obvious, and we're a subject where the interconnectedness of those strands of knowledge is what makes our discipline. So I think there's a good piece of work that the colleagues can do, just checking that there is that cohesion there. I would say the other thing that is always I would reflect on as something that schools sometimes struggle with a little bit is around assessment. Do the assessments actually check what pupils know, and will they flag to the teacher what bits of knowledge are missing, or what's been misconceived, or even what's been missing in the curriculum? So actually give that reflective, not just to get better at geography, you need to, but actually internally within the school, is our curriculum actually hitting the mark that we want it to do? We've also got the power of assessment that supports children remembering more, supporting their memory, and there's plenty been written. You can find it in journals like Teaching Geography and things like Interweaving, Interleaving, Space Practice. That concept of bringing previously learnt knowledge back to the front of the working memory, that's going to really help pupils to get better at geography. So I think they're probably the big principles that colleagues might want to have a think about, John.
Is there anything else about the strengths and weaknesses of say, the way they look at the locality compared to distant places that's characterised by a lot of schools, or is it just different in different schools?
I mean, I would say one of the common things, I'm not saying it's universal, but certainly one of the common things we see, John, is that, and it's been reported by HMI over the decades, is that knowing where's where is not a strength of pupils in this country. So it's ever been thus. I think I certainly can go back to about 1968 and find it in HMI reports. So it's been around for a long time. We got to really, I think now, one of the things I'm talking to our inspector workforce about is saying, we've got to really challenge that. We've got to ask, why is that the question? We're a spatially organized subject. So if we're not getting that basic of our subject, that framework that our subject's built on, then we've really got to think about why that's the case. We've got to encourage schools to think about why that's the case, and hopefully help children to get better at it. There's
some very powerful software, isn't there now, like Digimaps and ArcGIS, so that might be too complicated. I'll get told off for saying that now in primary, but probably not. But those give teachers and students the tools to be able to zoom in and out much more effectively than using just a whiteboard and a textbook. Do you see the uptake of digital technology increasing? And do you see that as a support for this sort of spatial understanding?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've not done any in-depth study to that, John. It is something that's on my radar of something I'd like to look a little bit more into. We're certainly entering into a time where the accessibility to those things is much more accessible. I remember when I was I don't know, probably 3 or 4 years into my career, I remember bidding to a gifted and talented fund to buy computers that were powerful enough to run a GIS system on, and having to set them up in the library. And it was a very, they were very technology intensive systems. Well, now you can do it on your mobile phone, so much more accessible to us, and schools are more IT rich now than they were when I started. I started in the 90s, and we had one computer room, and you had to book it out, and it only had enough for one computer between two. So, that we've come a long way since then. Do I commonly see it in my work? No, especially in the primary space, but actually even in the secondary space. I don't, but I would agree with you, John, and there's plenty been written on it. I think there's a few books that have come out recently that report specifically on, the power of digital approaches to strengthening children's geography, that schools should reflect on and see whether they can capitalize on these approaches. But to some extent, that will come back to, I mentioned before about the importance of teacher professional development. For some teachers, they've never used these systems. They might be used to using the Google Maps, but even Google Earth might be a step further on than that. And of course, other packages are available. But yeah, I mean, there's the potential there to support children's spatial thinking is quite significant. So I would encourage schools to think about how they can incorporate that into their curriculum. But incorporation is the important thing. There's no point just having it as a standalone stick-on unit. Let's use a GIS for the sake of running through and practicing some skills. Actually, we get the real power from it when we integrate it into our curriculum. So that would be my kind of thinking around technology, John.
I saw one. It was just so simple, but the pupils were amazed by it. They just plopped the British Isles on a map of Brazil. It's a piece of free software that you can use just to get a juxtaposition of the sizes of the two. And the pupils were saying, "What? Is it that big?" And you don't get that necessarily from a map, even a world map. You look at a world map and there's Britain over there and there's Brazil down there. And it's not the same as just the simple act of plopping one into another. It made a huge difference.
Sure. And I remember doing that exercise when I was training to teach, John, but we got the children to cut out a little bit of the British Isles, and then how many times can you fit that into Brazil? So so it's good to see that technology is doing things that we've been doing for years and years, but much more efficiently, I'm sure.
I remember doing that one with a world map, and the number of students who got confused between South America and Africa and would juxtapose those two continents because they don't quite see what we think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
There are many, many ways in which we can play around with understanding better what children actually see compared to what we think they see as geographers. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Amanda Spielman's described her ambition for Ofsted to be a force for good in education. What does that mean in practice for geography teachers? I think we've come some way towards understanding that because of what you've said already, but it would be nice for you to just take that through a bit further.
Yeah, I think, in the school space, Amanda's view as Chief Inspector is very much about we want children to benefit from building that body of knowledge that's going to stand them in good stead for whatever they choose to do in the future. And for us as geographers, we know that might end when they finish Key Stage 3, and that might be the end of their geography. Although really encouraging that more and more pupils are continuing to GCSE, and even our A-level numbers are up as well, which is great. But recognizing that, what this inspection framework does is make sure that breadth and balance of the curriculum is there, that richness starts to come through. And we know when new frameworks come in, the sector responds, and it takes some time to evolve. But, the speed of change is really quite heartening. Even having had a pandemic in the last couple of years, and the disruption that's caused, I think I'm really heartened by the way in which schools have embraced this new inspection framework as a tool for good, which is exactly what the Chief Inspector wanted it to do. It's making sure that the breadth and the balance of the curriculum is there. We know, especially in the primary space, other subjects taking priority, and so geography gets squeezed. There are cases where we've gone to primary schools and we're trying to play hunt the geography really, or identify the specific geography content that might be in some of the work that children are doing. But through this framework, we can really look at that and really see whether the curriculum is as well balanced as school leaders might tell us it is. And we also want to make sure that children have got opportunity to practice their skills and apply their knowledge. So in geography, we've talked a little bit about technology resources already, but the teaching and practicing and building up those fieldwork skills. I did a period where I was a senior examiner with AQA and did the coursework was my area of expertise. You used to speak to teachers at training events or whatever, and they say they come with very little knowledge of how to carry out fieldwork, and yet fieldwork is a requirement in our Key Stage 1 scheme of work and our Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. So it shouldn't really be that we're getting to the age of 14 and this is something we're having to teach as if children hadn't learned it before. So it allows, I think this mechanism that we've now got with this framework allows us to get into a bit more of the detail there to make sure that that's happening. And because head teachers don't always prioritise as things as for example the national curriculum might say they should do. And I think the other thing that comes through this, and again an agent for change and for improvement, is around valuing teachers and making sure that they've got the knowledge they need to train to teach children rather in the subject really well. We've got a pretty sizable proportion of non-specialist teaching geography in our secondary schools. And the new figures, I think, are just out, or it's around 12%, I think, of teachers teaching geography in secondary schools have not done geography beyond A level themselves. And the vast majority of our primary colleagues are in that same position. So for geography, it's a real priority, making sure that teachers get the subject knowledge, but also appreciate the discipline that is geography as well, how that knowledge has come about. So this inspection framework is an agent that helps that to happen. It kind of is reminding head teachers that and trust leaders and local authorities that is the agenda. And I certainly know from my own diary and that of colleagues, we're doing a lot more speaking engagements with trusts and universities and local authorities where we're just kind of embellishing on that a little bit more so that the people kind of know, and the uptake for it is really high. Our events that we go and speak at, we're seeing big audiences and people are really interested in this, I think, and certainly from the conversations I have with school leaders, because they really do see the value in it. It's a huge challenge. We don't underestimate that. It is a challenge. It is a change, but schools are really embracing it well, and I think that's all to the good of children's education, which is what the Chief Inspector set out to do when she started in 2017.
You mentioned fieldwork there, which is interesting because it does tend to be a tack on at times if you're not careful. And there's also a challenge with some leadership teams who don't want students to go out too much because of the risk assessment, because of the disruption, because of everything else. The last podcast we just had earlier this week was looking at virtual fieldwork. We didn't decide. I haven't parted in this. We'd call it digital fieldwork rather than virtual, because virtual has its own its own meaning. The sort of work where you can collect data and process it and look at it, but digitally. So you might be using drone footage, you might be using somebody else's video, but you've also got the opportunity for collecting material. It is an interesting one, which I think has been hugely pushed on by the pandemic. You mentioned the pandemic as well earlier on. So have you seen anything new with the use of digital fieldwork? You haven't had much chance with the pandemic, but it'd be interesting.
Yeah, and our focus has not been quite as tightly perhaps on individuals kind of subjects and looking through the lens of subjects over the last sort of 4 or 5 months, where we've been carrying out our monitoring inspections and our assurance visits. But certainly just from my own things that come into my inbox or things that I see published in journals, there's more of it around. There's the availability of digital fieldwork resources is certainly more prevalent than I've seen in my 20 odd years of working in this space. And I think we would all, certainly, conversations I've had with colleagues in the geography community, the value of going out and some of the soft skills perhaps that I learnt as a result of going out and doing the fieldwork. Children's risk assessing, children learning how to keep themselves safe when they're doing fieldwork are things that are not directly taught but are learnt, and I think are really important things that children should learn. But when situations constrain us that we can't safely go out, and the last year has been a good example of that, then it's a substitute, and it's to some respects it's better than not doing any at all, and possibly it's easier to integrate into your curriculum. So the swings and roundabouts to it. If it means that children are practicing their fieldwork skills more, and it's balanced with getting out when we can do, and getting out could just be in the school grounds. I think people forget the value that there is just in the schoolyard or a school field, or I do remember visiting a school where the children were all lined up against the fence on the school side of the fence, but there was a main road ran outside, and fairly young children were doing their traffic counts. Great fieldwork. We've all, I'm sure, taught microclimate fieldworks and looked at kind of how the school building might affect the conditions. So we can use our school site. We can go off site, and we would always prefer to go off site. Geography happens beyond our classrooms, but I think if we can capitalise on all the resources, the issue for me, John, is that pupils get to practice fieldwork skills, because we know by practicing we get better at things.
I think that's the beauty of virtual fieldwork, actually, because you can then practice those. If you take an inquiry approach, which is the best fieldwork, you can take an inquiry approach and explore Belize, if you like, because it's all virtual. So you can embed it right the way through.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'm not sure gets embedded as much as it could do, we had this conversation when we were putting together that book, Progress in Geography, with David Gardner, is the use of map work.
Yeah. And again, we need to teach those skills of how do we interpret a map, how do we construct a map, as well as how we interrogate a map and what we learn from it. So we know that's going to be most effective once we've got those kind of basic skills of how we read the map. Depending on what type of map it is, we know we need quite a broad range of skills there. But once we've got that, then again, it's that integration, isn't it? It's that application. I'm looking at a particular geomorphological phenomena. So how do I see that? How's that represented on a map? What do I recognise if we're in the human space on land use patterns, for example, or how things are changing, and we can look at maps over time. So yeah, I think they're hugely empowering to children, and equally we can draw on the work of. We've got people like Paul Owens, haven't we, who are doing loads of work on exploring children's mental mapping and what they bring with them, and then how we move on from there. Because an important principle we've got is always building from what children know and taking them on in their journey as well. So the power of maps, he says, as someone who's got a degree in the subject, is really important and should never be underestimated.
There is a lot of discussion, and we've really moved towards this about what's an effective geography curriculum. And you've mentioned a bit about its content and a bit about its sequencing. What do you think are the key features of an effective curriculum in geography?
I think we've gone through some of these already, John. So I think the main things are around, what the substance of what we're teaching, the content. Have we got it all there? Are we covering the breadth of knowledge? Are we thinking about things like that? If we think about case studies or examples that we might be using, have we really thought quite carefully about them and how they play in? Let's think about how we're structuring the sequencing, the cohesion of our curriculum, and is that optimized for children remembering what we're teaching them? We want to think about the practice, the things we just talked about, the drilling there of what's going on. We need to think, I think, a little bit more around, really around children's understanding and empathy for others. We're a subject that draws on the world and its people. So I think one of the things we would say, I would say from my point of view, as I go in and out of schools, is that the focus on place. I think maybe this is one area where the national curriculum doesn't help us as much as it could, and people's understanding of what place knowledge is might be something that we want to think. But if we think, I think it's Larson and Harrington who wrote about place allowing pupils to locate or orientate themselves with respect to the larger global space and other places. That's really important. My position in the world, but equally appreciating others, and we've got a real job to do there as the geography community. And it's that place that's going to connect with the physical topography or the human geography processes that are going on there, along with personal experience. So giving that real rich meaning to location, so we can really bring this all to life, because we're a real subject. It's happening day in, day out, minute by minute, and it's changing all the time. So we get that really, the relevance of our subject comes through really strongly. And I think that's one of the unique points of a geography curriculum, is that we can be really reflective, and children are motivated when they hear about things in the media, and then actually we can learn about why that's happening in geography. Is really helpful to them.
You mentioned Paula Owens there, and I've learned an awful lot from working with Paula about how young children experience place, and the work that she's done about how different people experience that same place. One of the little activities she did was just imagine that you're only 2.5 feet tall and you're walking along the road, and there's a huge lorry going past with wheels that are bigger than you are, and then using that with older children to say, what's their experience? Where do you feel safe? Where do you feel challenged? Where do you feel scared? What's this place doing to you? And then working on that to compare with distant places, so they have a much better understanding that people in their place don't necessarily see the place in the same way as they do.
Yeah, no, really important. Yeah.
You've done some work, haven't you? You've got an article in Primary Geography. It's called Empowering Geography, a view from Ofsted in Primary Geography. That's in the spring edition, isn't it? Spring 2021.
Yeah, just the last edition, John.
So we must do a link to that one. And you talked about the empowering nature of the subject on pupils' experience. And you've started to talk about that. I just wonder if there's anything else you want to add. What did you mean by that?
There's a couple of messages I wanted to bring through that article. It's a fairly short article, but one, location is important. And geography is the subject that teaches it. So we've already mentioned children's locational knowledge is relatively weak from the work that we've done, but also many others have done in the field. So if we don't teach it in geography, then the chances of it being taught at all are pretty slim. And children are interested in location. I think give pupils an atlas or a map, and my experience has always been that they engross themselves in them for a very long time. It's bringing those connections, it's helping pupils to contextualize things. So the eureka moments of, I didn't realize that was where that was, is really good. I didn't realize that in your case Africa and South Africa and South America are different places. That's always really quite helpful. But I think also when in other aspects of the school life, so even like when they're reading a novel with the class teachers, if I'm in the primary space or they're in a period of reading in secondary schools. Lots of secondary schools these days are setting a bit of time aside each day for children to read. then actually we're really bringing that book that they're reading to life, because they appreciate more around the setting, the geography and the atmospheric conditions that might be going on. So the richness of what they read and the level of comprehension is enhanced by it. And in that sense, it really empowers pupils in building their knowledge and their understanding. And the third thing is, when you know where places are and you know the kind of conditions of those places, then actually go back to the cognitive science, that takes away some of that cognitive load, because you already know that stuff, and so you can move on more quickly. The second strand I really wanted to draw out in that article was around place. It's one of the I've said to you just as we've talked this morning around, it's potentially the least well understood of our strands within the national curriculum. And I think I'll probably speak a bit more on this at the GA conference in April, so I won't say too much at this point. But the importance of that connectedness and that empathy that you've just talked about through that example you used of Paula's is really important, and actually gives sense of agency to the pupil themselves. So we're foregrounding that. I think with those two aspects, and I'm taking at it from 2 points of view. From a school leadership point of view, the importance of geography as part of the curriculum, in enriching the curriculum and helping children's memories and understanding, and then from the pupil's point of view of promoting their agency in the world is, for me, they're two of the big contributors that geography brings.
Does Ofsted have a view on how best to teach geography lessons? I got the impression in the past sometimes, not from Ofsted necessarily, but from publications, how to teach the best Ofsted lesson. And you've got this massive tick list.
Well, no, that's an important question. And John, that's probably one of the questions we're asked most often. So reassuringly, the answer to it is no. But I think what we can say is we do know that teaching what's best when a number of conditions are fulfilled. One is well matched to what pupils already know, that the teaching builds on that, and that pupils gain new knowledge and they remember it. So you could take those 3 points, but no, there's no typical approach that Ofsted would say is more effective than another. It will depend on the children and the context every time.
I think in the past that's frightened teachers, because they thought there's one way to do it. And the message is not necessarily coming from Ofsted, but it comes from a leadership team, should I say this, that have perhaps misunderstood. So you must do a 3-part lesson, was what we had, but that's years and years ago. It's a tricky one. And that's really interesting to hear that from you. Thank you. I wanted to ask you just a couple more questions as we run to the end of this. How are non-specialists trained? Because I think geography is probably one of the most difficult subjects. You've said places is misunderstood at times. So how do you train non-specialists to look for the sorts of intricacies that a geographer would find, but a non-specialist might not?
And I think that comes back to the point I've made previously, John, is around the professional development, the in-service professional development that school leaders make sure that their staff get, and particularly for those who are non-specialists. But for those of us who are specialists, we need to be kept up to date. So, is there a rich diet of professional development that staff can get access to? You've mentioned the GA, of course. There's the RGS, and there are other professional organisations out there as well. But being members of the subject community as well are really important. There are loads of opportunities, and actually, one of the things through the pandemic, the accessibility to all that training and knowledge building for teachers has dramatically increased. And the advent of or our revelationary findings of things like the online video conferencing packages has really opened that up, and certainly the number of people who are joining sessions that I might be leading for an hour after school, I've never done so many, if I'm being perfectly honest.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one last one, I think. What are the key strengths and weaknesses Ofsted find with geography?
So that changes as time goes by, John, but I would say consistently over the years, and the positives, it's consistently comes out as a subject that engages pupils, and the aspects that they're learning, they're seen as being relevant, and they really capture pupils' interests. So it's real strength. Recent change is the greater focus on geography as a subject, especially in primary schools. I mentioned earlier, it often got kind of lost. Now, head teachers are very keen to make sure we can identify, and children can identify, and more importantly, the teachers can identify when they're actually teaching geography. So there's more geography in the curriculum, which for me is a mighty triumph, and I'm really pleased about that. And you would think that as an advocate for geography, and certainly there's better thought going into what's being taught, how it's taught, how it links. So that's all on the positives. So it's an improving and positive picture in that sense. On the flip side, we've talked about locational knowledge still being quite variable. The concept of place tends to be reduced just to that comparing locations rather than the richer grasp that we've talked about this morning. Teacher knowledge we've just talked about. I think that is a challenge both in content and pedagogical understanding, and the dynamism of our subject having to keep up to speed as well. And the role, the increasing prevalence of non-specialist teachers as well. So the need for good CPD becomes even more important. So I'd say, in a nutshell, that's kind of the synopsis of geography at the moment. It will change. We're hoping that we'll be able to kind of resurrect the old thematic reports at some point in the not too distant future. So hopefully we'll be able to get some more information out in the fullness of time.
Well, that's been most interesting and really useful too. So thank you very much for your time today. I just want to finish really on just asking you if there are any top takeaways or top tips that are hot off the press that we should be telling geography teachers. What advice would you give?
There's a number of things you can do. Or you might want to do. Ofsted never prescribes. So you might want to check the scope of your curriculum. Are you actually covering what's set out, at least that which is set out in the national curriculum? Ask yourself the question of, does it hang together well? And really the test for that is, do pupils remember what you've taught them, both short term and long term? I've harped on in this podcast, John, about location and place. So are you giving enough attention, teachers, to location and place in your teaching? Not and if you're a primary school teacher, not just in the geography, but are you bringing it out through all the subjects that you're teaching when it's appropriate? And then I guess the last point is, are colleagues getting the support and the CPD that they need? They would be my kind of takeaway points, John. I think we're an improving place, and we want that journey to continue.
And that's a really positive place to end, I think, an improving place. That's really been fascinating today. Thanks very much, Ian.
John, thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed today's episode of JogPod, you might also enjoy the GA Annual Conference. Taking place online from Thursday the 8th to Saturday the 10th of April this year, the conference gives you access to over 100 lectures and workshops from academics and teachers. There is also a programme of social events, giving you the chance to network with other teachers, alongside an exhibition, so you can discover what's on offer to support you. Prices start at just £50 for the full 3-day conference, and student members of the GA can attend for free. Search GA Conference online for more information.